the endocrine system, which is the system that deals all with hormones. Okay, it's one of the least talked about systems, I'll say, the least popular. For some reason in grade school, they talk all about bones and muscles and digestive system, and sometimes heart. And then I honestly think the elementary school teachers shy away from the endocrine system, because then you got to start talking about things like the reproductive system, and testosterone and estrogen, and it's good stuff. But I think that's why they shy away from it. I don't want to focus. There we go. I think that's why this system isn't discussed very much in the elementary school. But it's cool stuff, because we are the result of all of our hormones. So endocrine system, composed of multiple glands, 5 major glands. There's of course more. We'll talk about the 5 big ones here. Pituitary in your brain. Thyroid sits right in your neck, or of the base of your neck, on each side of your trachea. The adrenal glands are in your back. They sit right on top of the kidneys. And then, of course, the gonads, testes, and ovaries right on top of the points of your hips if you're female, and in the groin if you're male. And then the pancreas sits right under the liver. So as you look at your rib cage, you have this cartilage shield in the middle called the sternum. And then at the base of the sternum, to the left is your stomach, and to the right is your liver. So your liver sits right here. And then right underneath of the liver is the pancreas. And the pancreas is an amazing organ. The pancreas does like 5 different major things. And same thing, the pancreas gets no love. Most people only know about the pancreas for insulin and diabetes, which, don't get me wrong, that's important. But the pancreas does a lot more than that. Okay, so what we're talking about here are all of these glands, right? And what a gland does is it sends out information to the somatic cells, and then changes the behavior of the somatic cells. It might activate the somatic cells. It might inhibit or turn off the somatic cells, might cause them to produce hormones themselves, might cause them to go through mitosis, all sorts of things. But the gland sends a chemical message, and you know what these chemical messages are. Those are hormones. So, most adults talk about, teens, or I tell people, I teach high school, how do you deal with the teens? I mean, teens are usually pretty straightforward. It's the adults that drive me crazy. And so hormones, fine. All a hormone is a chemical message. That's all it is, right? And so how does the hormone get from the gland to the somatic cells? It's easy. It's dissolved in the blood. So this is why when someone starts having different symptoms and they're concerned about disease, the first place that the doctors run to is the blood. The blood is a wonderful indicator of your biochemistry and what your cells, or how your cells, are communicating with each other. Which hormones are at very high levels, or possibly which hormones are at very low levels. Both pieces of information will tell you a lot. So that's why whenever someone is ill and they're not quite sure why, the thing they do, blood test, and they test hormones to see what the glands are telling the somatic cells, and then what the somatic cells are returning, because these produce hormones as well. What hormones are then coming back to the glands. Okay, so the first one that we're going to hit is your pancreas. We're going to talk about the pancreas a lot. So this is a 6A, isn't it? Yeah, 6A. So let's hit the pancreas. So we've already talked about the pancreas earlier. The pancreas has an odd spelling. There's no E on the end of pancreas. It's just CREAS. We already talked about the role of the pancreas with its digestive enzymes, and also the buffers that the pancreas produces. Really important, because as that acidic material comes out of the stomach, what we call chyme, as that chyme comes out of the stomach, you have to get that pH that's down at 2 up to 7 as fast as possible, so that you don't denature the digestive enzymes that are in the small intestine. So one of the main jobs of the pancreas, as the chyme leaves the stomach, is to release these buffers and bring that pH up quickly, usually in a distance of about 20 to 30 centimeters at the beginning of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Fine. So that's one job of the pancreas. What we're going to talk about now is blood sugar, right? So the first hormone that we're going to talk about is glucagon. Now, most students are thinking insulin, which I understand. We'll talk about insulin second, because if I present insulin first, then you get way too distracted by insulin. So we'll talk about glucagon first, and then get that content comfortable, and then we'll hit insulin. So glucagon is simply a hormone. It's a common one, and it is the antagonist of insulin. Okay, so if insulin is a response, your blood sugar is too low, glucagon does the same thing, except with a different organ. So the pancreas is a hormone from the liver. Well, that's the wrong word. That was my first mistake for today. There should be a word in between. It should put causes. Tempting to get a new piece of paper, but I won't. Well, maybe. That's all right. That causes, there we go. It causes the liver to release glycogen. Now there's a question. There's a question back in core 2. In fact, I was talking about it with the juniors just the other day. Where's that macromolecule question? I should write that in my notes. There we go. Topic 3, core 2. If I were you, I would go back to topic 3 in core 2, and I should write that down while it's in front of me, and refresh your memory as to the polysaccharide of glycogen, because all this is a long polymer of glucose. That's all it is. That's topic 3, core 2. Cool. Capture it forever. Put the juniors away now. So polysaccharide, poly meaning many, saccharide from saccharide meaning sugar. So all glycogen is a polymer of glucose. It's just a long chain of glucose is all it is. Thus, it is a polysaccharide. That's it. Okay. So all we need to do is draw a series of glucoses. There's no way that I'm going to have you draw all of the glucoses. That's mean-spirited. So draw 3, 4, 5, 6, totally up to you. It's the classic hexagon of glucoses. Just know that in glycogen, there's 18 of them, all right? And then there's this U-shaped bond of carbons in between. So all this is a long chain of glucoses. That's all it is, okay? And glycogen is actually released when blood glucose is low. So glucagon is a hormone that causes the liver to release glycogen. But where is glucagon from? Glucagon is from the pancreas, okay? So the pancreas releases glucagon. Glucagon is the hormone that goes to the liver, and it causes the liver to release glycogen, okay? So let's summarize that. So we go from pancreas, releases glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone that goes to the liver. This causes the liver to release glycogen. Okay. All right, well, glycogen. Glycogen is a polysaccharide, right? It's made of multiple glucoses. Well, once this polymer of glucose is dumped in the blood, then enzymes start cutting the bonds in between the glucoses, and this actually increases blood glucose levels, okay? So this is released when blood glucose levels are low, okay? If you've got a lot of blood in your sugar, excuse me, you've got a lot of sugar in your blood, you're not going to dump more sugar into the blood. That's ridiculous. So this series here only occurs when your blood glucose is low, when you haven't eaten for multiple hours, Okay, this is one of the reasons why starvation diets don't work. This idea of like, oh, if I starve myself, then I'll lose fat. It's not accurate. You have about a 3 to 4 day storage of glycogen in your liver. Okay, so if you go through a starvation diet, you're living off of the sugar in your liver for about 2, 3, 4 days. Okay, depends on your diet and your age and all sort of kind of stuff. And then after that, you start breaking down protein. You actually break down fat last. Okay, so starvation diets, if you're trying to lose fat, starvation diets aren't the way to go. Exercise. Okay, so if you dump this polysaccharide into the blood, what this does is it drives blood glucose levels back up. Okay, so that makes sense. Good morning. Might see that we have a trend. The trend is to wear the blue T-shirt. That's pretty funny. Not the same one, but the same color. Anyway, blood glucose levels are low. That causes the pancreas to release glucagon. That causes the liver to release glycogen. Glycogen is then digested, and that drives blood. Come on, Andrew. That drives sugar levels in the blood up. Okay, so this protein is produced by the alpha cells in the pancreas. And you think, why is it important for me to know that it's the alpha cells? Because there's a second class of cells called the beta cells, and it's the beta cells' responsibility to release insulin. So in a structure in the pancreas, there's an islet, and inside of the islet, there's alpha and beta cells, right? So the alpha cells release glucagon, which increases blood sugar. Okay, so with all biochemistry, there's always balance, right? So if there's one hormone that increases blood sugar, there has to be a hormone that then decreases blood sugar. We call them antagonists, right? One goes up and the antagonist does the opposite and drives the value down. So glucagon drives blood sugar up, and now we'll talk about its antagonist, insulin, which drives the blood sugar down. So that's a lot of content for about 9 minutes. Okay. Any questions on this before we leave it? Okay.
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay, cool. Well, if we're driving blood sugar up, then we need to talk about the hormone that drives blood sugar down. Okay, the antagonist. So we're still talking about the pancreas. It's not over there. Right there. So good old insulin. Oh my gosh, how often have we talked about insulin? Especially with all the biotech that we do. Oh, I have a lot of biotech to teach the juniors when they're seniors because we're not going back to the classroom. Here we go. All right, so insulin. Insulin is a hormone. That drives glucose from the blood into your somatic cells, okay? So any glucose, well, not most of the glucose that's in the blood, when insulin is placed in the blood, the glucose is then transported into the cells, okay? So insulin lowers blood glucose levels. That's why Miss Maines has to monitor her blood glucose levels, okay? Because if her blood glucose gets too low, that's simple. She simply needs to eat more glucose. If her blood glucose gets too high, that means that she needs to elevate the amount of insulin that's being pumped into her system. Okay, but it's this constant monitoring, right? Because she doesn't want to do this peak and valley thing. She wants to hover just a little bit all around a homeostatic value, about 110, 120, depends on her biochemistry. So let's draw ourselves a blood vessel. Such. Simply blood vessel. And since we're going about diffusion in and out of the blood, this is a capillary, okay? So you have blood flow here. Cool. And then you have glucose present in the blood. Okay? The capillary then runs next to somatic cells, like such. So all these are just somatic cells. Easy. And materials diffuse into the blood and out of the blood constantly. It's one of the major functions of the blood. Cool. So what happens is there are gateways, membrane proteins that are specific to glucose. And the gateways, these membrane proteins, are closed to glucose. But what insulin does is insulin bonds to these protein gates and opens them. Just like we talked about the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, how acetylcholine opened the sodium channels, okay? Here, insulin opens the proteins for glucose. And once these proteins are open, glucose can then enter the cell. So these here, these are insulin receptors. Okay, so insulin is the key that opens the door for glucose to then get into the cell. And once glucose is in the cell, then the cell can go through cellular respiration and produce ATP. Okay, so this is why then we talked about insulin being the antagonist of glucagon, because since insulin is pulling the blood, come on, why am I switching these? Since insulin is pulling the glucose out of the blood, that means insulin lowers blood glucose levels. So insulin drives glucose into the cells, thus lowers blood glucose. This is why Mainz has to be gentle. That blood glucose is high. She can't just dump in a bunch of insulin, okay? Because if she dumps too much insulin, she'll go from being hyperglycemic to hypoglycemic, and that's just as dangerous. If nothing else, it's more dangerous, because if she gets too low on her blood glucose, that'll start shutting down her nervous system. She can pass out and go into a diabetic coma. Okay, so really, if she has a choice, it's actually better to be hyperglycemic than hypo. Neither is a good choice, but it's better to have a little too much than not enough. Okay, so just like we talked that insulin is produced by the alpha cells in the pancreas, then glucagon is produced by the alpha cells in the pancreas. So then insulin is produced by the beta cells. Okay. Now, if you ever get confused on these, especially during the exam, you'll start thinking glucagon, insulin, alpha cells, beta cells. It's alphabetical. Okay. So if you think that alpha comes before beta, then you think that glucagon alphabetically comes before insulin. And if you remember that, you'll never confuse the two. It's alphabetical. Okay. A comes before G. Oh, wow. A comes before B. It's going to be that kind of day. A comes before B, and G comes before A. Wow. A comes before B, and G comes before I.
Mr. Monroe,
Yeah.
can you go down to the bottom of the page again?
Sure. And then we're going to draw the pancreas down.
Mr. Mano,
Yes.
is there any sort of condition where the body doesn't produce enough glycogen?
Not that I'm aware of. So is there a condition like diabetes for the beta cell? Is there a diabetic for the alpha cells? That's a cool question. I'm sure there is. I'm not aware of it. Find it. Could you let me know? I would love to know that.
All right.
That's a cool question. Is there a diabetic condition for the alpha cells? I don't know. That's cool. I need an endocrinologist. That's cool. All righty. So the pancreas. Pancreas is an interesting shaped organ. It's kind of a, and then in the large, the head of the pancreas is this area called the islet of Langerhans, which is a ridiculous name. But the where the cells are, it's this extension of tissue called an islet, and this tissue was first detailed by an anatomist named Langerhans. If you want to know, it looks like Langerhans, but it's Langerhans. So in his honor, we call it the islet of Langerhans. And then inside of here are the alpha cells and the beta cells. And we don't know why. Usually in a prepubescent teen or early in puberty, the immune system attacks the islet of Langerhans and destroys the beta cells. And that's one of the major causes of type 1 diabetes. That's why they refer to type 1 diabetes as juvenile onset. Okay, juvenile meaning a child, onset is when it starts. And so it's extremely common to have juvenile onset type 1 diabetes. Okay, and it's an autoimmune disorder. For some reason, teens start to hit that insulin, that hormone spike. Don't trust anything I say today. As teens start to hit that hormone spike, it for some reason triggers the immune system to attack these cells, and that causes type 1 diabetes. So this is the pancreas. So if you figure out how that happens and how to block it, that would be super, super cool. That's a deal. Maybe find the genes that are associated with it, develop a screen when the child's about 8, 12 years old, start monitoring their hormone level. Starts, then block the immune system, but not so much that you give them AIDS. Do you still need? Yeah, take it. Better question. Does anyone still need this? That's a better question. All right. All right. So, juvenile onset of diabetes. That's a type 1 diabetic. That's what Kayla Maines is. So this is still 6A. She is what we call a type 1 diabetic. So means that she's dependent on insulin. And as you'll know, the insulin doesn't come, if human insulin doesn't come from our fellow humans. It's been produced by E. coli by transformation for almost 30 years now. This is not new tech. This is very, very old tech, actually. And the general public still doesn't know. I don't know why. And this is an autoimmune disorder. Now, be careful. Don't go into Maine's class and tell us you got a disorder, right? Be gentle, but really, technically, medically, that's what it is. And so what happened was her B cells were destroyed. That's why I'm interested in Mr. Marquez's question about the alpha cells. That's a good question. I'll have to look that up. So if you destroy the B cells, then you have no insulin production. Now, that's a bit of a generality, depending on the severity of your type 1 diabetes, depends on how many of the beta cells are destroyed. So I'm taking an extreme example here and saying that most or all of the beta cells were destroyed. Technically not true. You can have a mild type 1 diabetes if only some of it. So it's possible, very common for type 1 diabetics. It's the overwhelming majority of the beta cells. All right, so they don't produce insulin. So what? Well, then that means that the glucose just sits in the blood. And that means that the glucose cannot get to the cells. And with so much of this biology, I always want you questioning, Why? So what? Who cares? All right, so Mainz's immune destroyed her beta cells. So insulin. So what? So that means the glucose sits in the blood. It means the glucose doesn't go into the cells. All right, I'll keep playing toddler. So what? That means that there is no cell respiration, or very, very limited amounts. Well, no cellular respiration, no ATP. And oh boy, now we've got a problem. Okay. So when is monitoring, and actually she does it now Bluetooth. In the old days, they used to have to prick their finger and collect drop of blood, and that's that. And now, as an extension pump, has she talked to you about her insulin pump at all?
I believe so once.
No.
Okay. Okay. So then I'll give you some background. Kayla is what we call a brittle she's a brittle type 1 diabetic. What does that mean? It means that her blood glucose levels can change very quickly and dramatically. Okay. So she can go hypoglycemic very quickly, and she can go hypoglycemic very, very quickly. So most diabetics only have to use the insulin pen right before they eat. Okay, so if I'm going to eat, little insulin. I'm going to eat, little insulin. It's pretty simple. Except when you're a brittle diabetic. If you're a brittle diabetic, the peaks and valleys of your blood glucose are really high and really low. So instead of the pen every time she eats, Kayla needs a little bit of insulin all the time. Okay, so she wears what's called an insulin pump. And used to be about the size of a what I call a lipstick battery, right? Don't worry about it. Be about 10 centimeters long, about the size of your thumb. And she would just clip it to her belt, and then a little tube would come out, and she would place it under her skin somewhere in her abdomen, and it would just give her a little insulin all the time. She doesn't drop it in the vein. It's not intravenous at all. Okay, and so she's on an insulin pump all the time. About 5 years ago, the pumps went Bluetooth, which is really cool. So now she wears a device. It's about the size of a quarter. She can put it wherever she wants. She can put it on her shoulder if she wanted to. Of course, she doesn't, but you can put it anywhere. And integrated into the pump is a glucose monitor that's Bluetoothed to her phone. It's Bluetoothed to Ben, her husband's phone, and it's Bluetooth to her doctor as well. Okay, so she then sets the parameters of, hey, I want an alarm to go off if my blood glucose reaches this level, it's too high, and I want it to go off if it's too low. And so she doesn't have to sit there and say, oh, it's 9:30 in the morning. Hold on, everyone, I have to test my blood. Her blood's actually sampled all the time by this Bluetooth pump. It's super trick. And that's another example of the number of career opportunities that are associated with science. All too often we think, oh, to have a major in science, you're either going to be a medical doctor, you're going to be a teacher, or you're going to be the bench tech with a micropipetter. Well, all three of those are great opportunities. When you start talking about the software design, the writing of the code, the engineering of the device itself, the electronics, all of the science that it took, the STEM that it took to build that insulin pump, then the marketing, and there's so much more to science than wearing the white lab coat or being a teacher. If you're interested in the business part of it, or even the law part of it, it's all associated with the science, and it's super cool. All right, so that's type 1 diabetes, but then I need to be sure and talk about type 2, because that is going to impact a lot of you as well.
Mr. Mano,
Yes.
you said that people can wear the insulin pump on their shoulder.
They could. It would be a ridiculous place to put it, but you could. It doesn't have to go into the vein. It's simply subcutaneous, which means under the skin. Could be anywhere. Could be in your
But why
cheek.
would they put it on their shoulder?
Why?
Yeah, why?
It
Will they
was
reach
just
to their finger?
it was just an example. Where that comes from is when If I say a nicotine patch, do you know what I'm talking about? Where people are trying to quit smoking so they get the, okay, so if you watch those advertisements, they usually show the person taking the nicotine patch and putting it right on their shoulder. Nobody wears their nicotine patch on their shoulder. Same thing when Don ran the pharmaceutical studies in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this total breakthrough of delivering hormones for birth control through patches. Okay. And same thing as people are like, do I have to wear it on my shoulder? It's like, no, most people have they can where they can cover it with their clothes. Okay. So that's when I was talking about Kayla's pump, that made me think of the nicotine patch ads. I mean, really, she could put it here, but nobody does. They put it in on their abdomen, and it has a little tube that comes out of it, 3, 4, maybe 5 millimeters, and it just pierces the skin. Now, how often she has to move it, I've never asked. It's not really relevant. I mean, I would never, Kayla moves her insulin pump once every 3 days. I mean, it's none of my business. But it's the idea that this device provides her with insulin all the time, and this human insulin is actually produced by bacteria that are genetically engineered. Those are the concepts that we're trying to get across. But yeah, she could, I doubt she wears it on her shoulder. Maybe you should ask her. And if she's comfortable talking about it, she will. Or she might, shake you off and go, no, I'm not going to talk about that. That's fine. It's totally up to her. She knows how much I talk about her, and I have for years. And the insulin that I pass around class, that came from her. I have a couple of her pumps at school. I should go up and grab those. Another Post-it note so that I can show you. Or I might just check online. I'm sure there's some pictures of them. I'll just look up insulin pump.
Dad,
Yes.
the little girl in the kindergarten class that was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they put her Dexcom on the back of her right arm, right here. That way,
Really?
That way the parents and the teacher could see it and make sure it hadn't become dislodged, and she was so anxious.
Oh, that's interesting. So Em, as part of her teacher training, worked in a kindergarten class in Davis, and there was a kindergartner in the class with type 1 diabetes, which is really rare to have them that young. And just told me that they had her with her pump. You said on the back of her arm, like in the tricep.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So that they could see that she had it on and that it was still attached. So that way, while she was playing, if it became dislodged, they would see it wasn't on her arm. So here I say, it's a ridiculous place to put it. Well, okay, it's ridiculous for adults, but it's not ridiculous for children. That's interesting. You learn something new every day. That's cool. Okay, so let's talk about type 2 diabetes. Okay, this is not an autoimmune disorder. Okay, this is actually those insulin receptors. So this is the insulin receptors on the somatic cells do not work properly. Now, that is quite a generality, and there are a number of things that could be wrong with the receptor, but that is it. The basic idea is that the receptors become insensitive to insulin is the technical way to put it. Now, the reason why they become insensitive, that list is reasonably long. Okay, so here what happens, we draw the blood vessel. Wow, it's a big one. And then you have the blood. Okay, so same diagram as earlier. I used red for the glucose, didn't I? Make sure that the colors match. There's that line there, it is. I used insulin as red. So insulin is still present, and the glucose is green. Good. Okay, so here you have the somatic cells. And then you have the receptors. Except here, the receptors are what we call insensitive to the glucose. Okay, so the glucose is present in the blood, the insulin is present in the blood. However, the insulin is unable to bond to the receptor. And since the insulin is unable to bond to the receptor, that means the glucose cannot enter the cell. Okay? So here, the somatic cells are starving not because of a lack of insulin, it's because the receptors, the insulin receptors, are insensitive to the insulin. So this is the insulin receptor. Now, why I have a real responsibility to teach this is a racially and genetically linked condition. Okay, just a little bit. Much better. Okay, this condition of type 2 diabetes is most common in Hispanics. So each ethnic group, each genetic group has certain diseases, syndromes, disorders, whatever label you want to put on them, that is commonly found in that ethnic group, okay? There are racial differences, there are genetic differences, very minute, but they are different in these different populations. So it is extremely common in Caucasians to see cystic fibrosis and high cholesterol. In Africans, it's common to see high blood pressure. In Hispanics, it's common to see type 2 diabetes, okay? And the other thing that contributes to type 2 diabetes is obesity. Having a body fat that's over 30%, okay? So long-term obesity causes type 2 diabetes. But what's interesting is we don't know why. Okay. So my parents' generation, the issue was smoking, self-inflicted wound. And in my generation, it's high blood pressure. What's the most common health issue in your generation?
Diabetes.
Diabetes, okay? Caused by, do you know what a third of all children are in your generation?
Obese.
Obese, okay? Now, it used to be that in my generation that you'd have to reach the age of 40, 50, 60 before you would accumulate enough fat to be obese. There's a difference between being overweight and being obese, okay? Overweight means you've got an extra 20, 30, 40 pounds, depends on your body size, okay? When you're talking about being obese, you're talking about someone who is 30 to 40% body fat. It's a tremendous amount of fat, okay? Now, it used to be then that you'd have to be my age because it would take that long to accumulate that volume of fat. And so we know that once you get type 2 diabetes in my generation, your life expectancy is about 20 to 30 years, right? Well, that made sense if a 40 or 50-year-old person is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and they say, yeah, you're going to live to be about 70. And people go, 70, that's not a great run. That's pretty good, all right? But now, in your generation, we have children who are obese, okay? And what we don't know is if the life expectancy of these children, once they're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, if the life expectancy for them is also 20 to 30 years. And we're not going to know for about another 15 to 20. And if in your generation, we start seeing people who have been obese since they were children, right, are then dying when they're 30, 35, and 40. That's alarming, okay? And especially because why would a 5-year-old be obese? I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I'm 50, right? Or 51 or whatever I am, right? It makes sense if I'm obese. That's a self-inflicted wound, right? Okay, but why is a 5-year-old obese?
Lack of exercise.
Lack of exercise. Who's controlling that?
Parents.
The adult, you bet. Right? What about the quality of the food that the child's eating?
Also the parents.
Also the parent, okay? So imagine me walking up to a 5-year-old and handing them, you know, a cigarette and I don't know, some alcohol. How do you think the adult would feel about that? They'd flip out. What are you doing? You can't give a child a cigarette and alcohol. And I go, you're killing them with food and lack of exercise. What's the problem? At least the little guy can have some fun. right? And you sit there and go, man, you can't say stuff like that. That is, they literally call, I mean, we're not talking about it anymore because of COVID right now, we're a little distracted, okay? But this is quite literally, this is a health epidemic in your generation. This is really serious, okay? Because we don't know the life expectancy of children who are obese, and it might be really dangerous. And ultimately, the responsibility when small children are obese, that falls at the feet of the adult who's taking care of them.
Mr. Manuel,
Yeah.
do you also think like now learning from home, like I've noticed like when I see like my cousins or even my brother, now that he's not at school, he has gained a little bit more weight because they're not having recess or
Yep.
lunch. So
Yep.
learning from home also added to that, I feel.
Totally agree. We have small children. We have 3 boys that live next door. In our alleyway, usually in the afternoons between about 3 and 5, there's 6, 8, 10 kids playing outside, right? First of all, it's awesome to hear, right? Super active. Well, now because of COVID, everybody go to their corners, don't. So they're sedentary in front of the computer, and they're not going outside to play the recess, or there's very limited recess. I totally agree. Could be a contributing factor. Yeah, another benefit of COVID, right? Oh, I gotta get a vaccine. I can't wait for the discussion about science and vaccines. It's coming. It's going to be just fascinating. All right, so 6A, flow chart, and the question will finally be done. I promise these later questions, 6B, C, D, and E are as short as 6A is huge. 6A is a huge question. If I were, I would open up a fresh page because we're going to use the majority of this page. I'm going to do it like that. And so I'm going to put in the middle here, we're going to do a gold chart here with blood glucose. And so at the top will be too much, and the bottom will be too little, and in the middle will be just right. Okay, so I'm starting in the middle, but understand that I'm going to put something up here on top. I'm going to put something down here on the bottom for the Goldilocks principle of too much, too little, and just right. So in the middle, typical blood glucose levels, right about, let's go there. Oh, blood glucose level, like such. Okay, so then let's go down here for Goldilocks, and let's go up here for Goldilocks. Okay, so if it's up here, it's too high, your blood glucose is too high. What we call hyperglycemic. And then we go down here, and this would be too low. And this would be hypoglycemic. Boom. I can zoom in on that a little bit to make that bigger for you. It's a little too small. Can I squeeze that in? There we go. That's pretty good. Cool. So when we're down here, there's a hormonal response, and when we're up here, there's a hormonal response. Okay? So if your blood glucose gets too high, there's a response from the pancreas. And the pancreas releases insulin. The insulin is produced by the beta cells. Whereas if your blood glucose is too low, it's still the pancreas that responds. But the pancreas releases the antagonistic hormone, which is glucagon. That's just a touch too much. Okay. And that's produced by the alpha cells. Like such. Okay. So my blood glucose is just right. My blood glucose is too high. My blood glucose is too low. Cool. So the point of these antagonistic hormones is to bring blood glucose back to what we call a homeostatic value. right about 110, 120. I think it's micrograms per microliter. I think the units are. So insulin, what does insulin do? Insulin causes glucose to be absorbed by the somatic cells. You now know that it's the insulin that opens the receptor, so it's the key that bonds to the insulin receptors, and glucose is then transported into the cell. And as glucose is transported into the cell, your blood values return to typical blood glucose levels. Okay, it's this cycling. Okay, we want to cycle just a little bit. We don't want these really high highs, because biochemically, that's always followed by really low lows. We don't want peaks and valleys. We want just a little up and a little down. Okay, this will happen to you in college. You stay up too late, so the following morning and you hammer sugar and caffeine. Boom, there you go. Right, in the morning lecture, you're feeling great. And then about 11 or 12 o'clock, you crash. So what do you need? Boom, you need more sugar and caffeine. And you go through the day like, okay, this is what do the same thing. And then they get home at night and they're all cranked up on the adrenaline from the day and the caffeine from the day. And then here come the sedatives, right? Here comes the alcohol. Why? I need to chill out, right? But then you start consuming large amounts of alcohol and then you hit that low. And then you wake up tomorrow morning and you're low. So what do you need? Boom, more stimulants. And you start going through life like this, okay? That's hard living. You don't want to do that, okay? Little bumps, okay? I'm not saying caffeine and sugar and even alcohol when you're old enough. I'm saying moderation is with everything in science. Okay, so then down here, if your glucose is too low, then the liver responds to the glucagon hormone. The liver releases glycogen, which is that polysaccharide that we back in core 2 a long time ago. Okay, and that is then converted to glucose, which you well know is a monosaccharide. You're then increasing the levels of the monosaccharide glucose in your blood and you return to normal. IB loves to ask this. They love it, okay? Because they have a limited number of questions to ask a lot of content, okay? So by asking about diabetes, they're hitting your immune system. They can talk about homeostasis. They can talk about hormones. They can talk about organs like your pancreas. They can talk about macromolecules with mono and polysaccharides. They can talk about the plasma membrane with the receptors for glucose. They can talk about biotech and GMOs with the production of the insulin. I mean, you're hitting 6, 7, 8 different topics with one question. Those are the types of questions, and that's the type of content the IB exam writers are attracted to, okay? Because they have like 50 topics to test you on, but they only have like 10 questions, all right? So they like to hit things like, what's the one that makes you resistant to malaria? It's the genetic, all I think of is hemophilia.
Sickle cell?
Sickle cell, thank you. They love to ask about sickle cell because they can hit genetics, they can hit blood, they hit evolution, they hit natural selection, right? And so they're looking for these topics that they can cover multiple areas by asking one question. This is a classic IB question, and that's why I spent so much time on 6A, because there's a lot to it, okay? But that reminds me, where is Selena? Oh, here, SELENA. So do me a favor, and when you guys are in college in 12 months, and you hit the same content. Can I get that picture? Can I see that picture, please? Interesting. No, I don't want my camera, goofball. Okay, I'm able to have the phone do things that you shouldn't be able to do. Em laughs at me because I do this with technology all the time. And I make tech do things it shouldn't be able to do. I mean, open a picture. All right, Em, come on over here.
Tell me, Daddy.
Please. It wasn't meant to be an I mean, this is not high tech. This is fun. Okay. So
How do you do this?
I don't know how I
How
do
do you
this.
do this?
Okay, what? This is child's play.
Mhm.
You know, like this. And I need Selena's text, and so it's that's the wrong one. It's right there. And this picture and okay, it wasn't just this also happens all the time. The tech doesn't work for me. And then I go to reproduce it when she's here. Never mind.
No?
No, never mind.
There's your picture.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for the help.
We're your witness, Mr. Monroe. We
Thank
saw
you.
it.
Thank
Oh.
you.
And
Seriously, this happens all the time. And she just looks at me like, old man. Well, sure, it wasn't working. I swear it wasn't working. All right. Now, this isn't going to be very. All right, Em, solve this one. All right, Fancy Pants.
Yeah.
Do you see how there's the image of the pancreas? Oh, if I tip it.
Solved it.
Why does that matter?
Because the light isn't coming directly at
Oh,
the camera.
it's a polarized
It's-
camera.
Yeah.
All right. So what's good grief? This is like a 10-minute thing for about a 10-second display. This is goofy. All right. So Selena is sitting in her, which class is she sitting in? She's sitting in her psychological science class. Excuse me, physiological science class. And what the professor is talking about is that. Okay. So do you recognize this tubular little organ right there? What do you think that is?
The pancreas.
That's the pancreas, right? And then her professor is talking about the hormone insulin, how the insulin then bonds to a receptor on the somatic cell, right? And when the receptor is activated by the insulin, it then opens a glucose gate and the glucose rushes in, okay? And while she's sitting there taking these notes, that's awesome. Do you see which core she has while she listens to her lecture? Can you see that? That's core 6. It's question 6A. Okay. This is an absolutely perfect example of my role in your education, because do you see how the professor is talking to her about the somatic cell? And what do you notice is different about the professor's explanation versus, I'll drop this in here, versus my explanation? What's the difference?
It's more detailed.
It's more detailed, okay? Now, technically, there's 2 membrane proteins, okay? One membrane protein is the insulin receptor, and there's actually, if you really want to know, there's a ligand protein that sits right there. And when the insulin receptor bonds to, when the insulin hormone bonds to the insulin receptor, there's a protein here that then transports by cyclic AMP over to the glucose channel, and the channel opens, and then, the gate opens, and that allows glucose in. But that's college level content, okay? So while her classmates are trying to wrap their mind around alpha cells and beta cells and the pancreas and glucagon and glycogen and insulin and glucose and diabetes, and they've got all this stuff flying at them, right? Selena's sitting back with her core 6 and understands just about everything that's going on. And the only thing that she has to tackle is that there's actually a difference between the insulin receptor and the protein, the gate, the membrane gate that allows the glucose into the cell. Okay, so that's a perfect example of my role, that I always tell you there's more to it, there's more to it, there's more to it. What I'm doing here is I'm establishing a foundation. And if you're a non-science major, then you leave here with just a ton of science in your head. You pass the test, and I'll be the last biology teacher you take voluntarily or involuntarily. And you go off and you study your English or your politics or your history or whatever you decide to do. Very cool. And then if you're a bio major, you will sit in class and you'll see this content all again, okay? But the beauty is, while your classmates are all taking notes, you can sit back with your core and go, oh, I haven't heard of that. And then you start adding layers, because you will be really surprised how much of your lectures that you'll miss in college because your head's down and you're taking notes, okay? That's why I'm trying to train you with informal core and formal core, because the beauty of what you have now is the majority of your professors record their lectures, they'll podcast them, okay? And so then you sit in class with your raw notes, your informal core, and you take those notes, and then you go back to the dorm or the library or wherever you study, and you go through the lecture and make sure that what you have in the notes matches what the professor presents. And he may have been saying things simply because your notes and your notes makes total sense. Okay. So when you are the college student in 2 years and 3 years and you hit stuff right out of court, do me a favor, help me out, because by then I'll have a freshman or sophomore right now in my class. Oh, so-and-so's up at such university, and I'll probably have difficulties with my phone then too, whatever. And show them the pictures so that they see this path, how IB is the introduction into college and simply builds on the foundation. It's all a flow, and it's super cool.